Hello everyone, I'm Santiago, and today I'm going to be testing an i5-8400 paired with a GTX 1060 3GB on 15 games. If you want to skip to one of those particular ones, just check the timestamps down in the description. This will be using 16GB of RAM on dual channel DDr4 at 2666 MHz, since that's the maximum the motherboard supports. And why am I using 16GB? Well, that's because I want to show you which games use more than 8GB of RAM, so you can know what to expect about the RAM usage on these games. I'll be talking on each of the games and telling you specifically what's going on, and at the end of the video I'll be doing a conclusion where I will talk about the RAM usage, the CPU usage, the GPU, if it's worth it or not, other options that you can explore, all that kind of stuff. All the testing shown here was done on 1080p using different settings, so I'll talk more about those on each of the games. So first we have Battlefield 1, and I'm going to be using a mix between high and ultra. Lighting quality, effects quality, post-process quality and mesh quality will be lowered from ultra to high, so we can have a more consistent frame rate. Sometimes in some matches when there's a lot of people on screen, a lot of explosions, with the highest settings it can usually drop below 60 frames per second. Quite rare, it doesn't happen each of the times, but by just lowering those options from ultra to high, I get over 60 frames per second all the time, which is what I'm looking for in this video. And the game doesn't look that different by just lowering those settings compared to the maximum settings. And well, so far the game was, as I said, over 60 frames per second, and sometimes the CPU usage can reach over 90% usage, which was very surprising to me. This game uses even more CPU than I thought, which is quite impressive. It uses a lot of CPU for real on 64 player matches, and on this one you need more than 8 gigs of RAM. It uses a little bit over 8 GB, so it's not such a huge deal, but if you have 8 gigs of RAM, I would expect some rough stutters every now and then, especially on 64 player matches in a map like this, but I'll talk to you again in the next game. Now I'm testing Far Cry 5, and on this one I'll be using almost the maximum settings once again. I'll be lowering shadows, geometry and vegetation from ultra to high, the rest just cranked up to the max, which is always good to know. And on this one so far, the most demanding things that I've run into were just having a lot of foliage on screen, so I'll be running a little bit into a foliage heavy area. Then fighting many enemies and explosions can also be a big impact in performance, so I'll be exploding some vehicles and fighting some enemies at the same time. The GPU usage was maxed out almost all the time, which is a good thing because the CPU is doing its job correctly. So I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Get ready, cause I'm...
He says he wants to leave Eden's Gate, and we gotta try and help him.
Peggy's are trying to take him back. Gotta stop him.
Peggy's at the back! More from the back! I got a visual.
PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds or PUBG. On this one I'll be using a mix between high and ultra pretty much. Post-processing and shadows will be on high, textures on medium, the rest just cranked up to the max. And I'll be going into Pochinki in the alt map, which is the place that I always test, because usually players jump into that area and that stresses the system, which is what I'm looking for in these videos. And so far we're over 60 frames per second all the time. There are some stutters every now and then that are very annoying, but that happens to me on all the builds I tested this game at, so I consider this a thing with the game, especially while driving. If you drive very fast, it can usually stutter quite a bit. So yeah, the game is still completely playable, and I'll talk to you again in the next game. Fortnite Battle Royale, and I don't have much to say about this one. It's just maximum settings and I'm getting over 70 frames per second pretty much all the time. So yeah, this one runs completely fine. Epic did a great job with performance on this one. So I'll talk to you again in the next game. Now I'm testing GTA 5, and on this one I'll be using pretty much the maximum settings on the standard part, including NVIDIA PCSS shadows, which are a very demanding type of soft shadows. And as always, to stress the system the most on this game, I go into the middle of two big streets and start just blowing up some vehicles. That usually puts a stress on the CPU and GPU, but you'll notice some drops below 60 frames per second when I am very close to the explosions. That's due to the NVIDIA PCSS shadows. By just changing that to the softest option, you can gain quite a bit of frames, so I recommend you do that. I do it in this video, so the drops below 60 frames per second are not as often, but there are many ways that you can improve the frame rate in this game by lowering some settings. I'm just trying to hit 60s, so if you want more frames, it's very easy to do so. Just play with the settings a little bit. So I'll talk to you again in the next game. I'm testing Assassin's Creed Origins, and on this one I'll be using pretty much high settings. I just lowered the texture options a little bit so I don't run out of VRAM because we only have 3 gigs. And well, on this game I'm going into Alexandria, which is one of the most CPU intensive places that you can find here. And to test that, I'm going to just look very far into the distance, then I'll just get into the ground and start doing some fighting because that's usually a big performance hit. And you'll notice high CPU usage as well. This game is also very demanding on the CPU, but we managed to hold over 60 frames per second pretty much all the time. I had some trouble with my other CPUs to do so. So yeah, on this one I was very surprised, and I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Best not to draw attention here.
Stop, you shit! Stop! Die.
Still.
Hey! Lighting the brazier! Touch, you dog! Come on, lads! This way! I can hit him! Whoa. Lighting the brazier!
Mine now!
Lighting the brazier! Hey! Got you now! Hey, what the? Time to go!
Now I'm testing Rainbow Six Siege, and on this one I'll be using very varied settings. On ambient occlusion I'll be using SSBC, on reflections I'll be using medium, shadow quality on the maximum, shading quality on medium, and then lens effects and depth of field turn off, because those options don't allow me to see the enemy sometimes. And well, I don't have much to say about this one, it runs completely fine, it's over 60 frames per second all the time. If you want to enable HBAO+, you can do so just fine, but the game will look darker indoors, which is usually something you don't want in this game because you cannot see the other players very clearly, which is a disadvantage. I recommend disabling ambient occlusion altogether. So yeah, this one runs totally fine, and I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Activating adrenaline surge.
Down to one friendly. Op 4 neutralized. Mission successful.
Now I'm testing Forza Horizon 3, and this time around, compared to my previous videos, I'm using different settings. That's because I ran into very big performance issues. For some reason, when I tested this with the i3 8100, it was totally fine, but then with the Ryzen 5 1600 I had some drops below 60 frames per second that made no sense. But now I found out what the problem was. It wasn't the CPU, it was the VRAM. Usually when games run out of VRAM, just stutter or have some hiccups in the frame rate. This one is very different. You just get lower frame rates, much lower frame rates actually. So by lowering the environment texture quality to low and the world car level of detail one step below, I managed to free up enough VRAM to make the game run at 60 once again. So on this one I recommend lowering all the VRAM related options. It's a bummer because the 1050 Ti can handle it at very similar settings, except in reflections for example, but the VRAM is just a very big limiting factor on this one, like on Forza Motorsport 7. These games are just very VRAM intensive, and that compromises the frame rate very much compared to other games. I'll talk to you again in the next game. Now I'm testing Just Cause 3, and on this one I'll be using almost the maximum settings. The only things I lowered were textures from very high to high so I don't run out of VRAM. And my testing methodology for this one is to blow up a couple gas stations, which are one of the biggest explosions in the whole game, and that's usually a big hit on the GPU and CPU. Then I'll just fly around a little bit. Usually since you move very fast through the map, there's a lot of CPU usage going on there, but overall the game was very stable. Again, on this one I was very surprised how the CPU handled all this stuff. I usually have some annoying stutters, and this one is another one that can use more than 8 gigs of RAM. After playing around 30 to 40 minutes, the system RAM usage can be way higher, especially if you're moving around a lot, which is pretty much the objective of the game. If you have 8 gigs on this one is fine, but after some time you might get some extra stutters. I'll talk to you again in the next game. Now I'm testing Rise of the Tomb Raider, and on this one it was quite easy to do so. I just put the high preset and just changed the anisotropic filtering to 16 times, and this one most of the time was over 60, but at the start of the footage you will see some drops below the 60 FPS target. That appears to be just GPU related because the GPU is maxed out. I didn't think it was a big deal, it was just on a very specific area of this map. The other maps ran way better than this one. This is the worst case scenario for saying it some way, so I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Wood for the fire.
They needed most of the lumber to repair the guard towers. We'll have to make do with what we have.
Well, if they need arrowheads for the battle, then I need more firewood.
Lara, I'm sorry if Sophia was less than welcoming.
I understand. I'm just glad you were there to vouch for me.
My people have spent decades fighting outsiders. It's not an easy habit to break. See if you can lend a hand with the preparations. A little hard work would go a long way towards building trust.
I'll see what I can do.
They will likely come from the air.
Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. On this one I'll be using almost the maximum settings, there will be no hairworks, and then full visibility range and detail level will be lowered from ultra to high in order to get a more consistent frame rate. And I'll be testing the city of Novigrad, which is one of the most CPU intensive places in the whole game, and it was fine. It was over 60 frames per second, so yeah, I don't have much else to say about this one. I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Oh!
Eternal fire burns bright in my heart. I say,
Your kind spreads disease, defeatism and desertion.
the hierarch, whosoever conceals a mage
Hitman, I'll be using a mix between medium and high settings. Shadow resolution and texture quality will be on medium. Due to the VRAM amount, if you use high textures, it can easily go over 3 GB. And I tested the Marrakesh level, which is one of the most demanding levels in the whole game. This one has a ton of NPCs on screen, a lot going on at the same time, so it's a big hit on the CPU and GPU. Unlike on other CPU intensive games, I was very surprised on this one. The i5-8400 was able to maintain over 60 frames per second all the time, even when my cover was blown and there were a ton of enemies shooting at me and people just running around. That's usually when the CPU is a limiting factor. So yeah, I was shocked about this one because it held up just fine, and I'll talk to you again in the next game. Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO. On this one I'll be doing a different thing than the other games. I'm using the benchmark map, which means that I'm doing a stress test. This is not representative on how the game actually runs when you're playing online, for example. This is meant to be a stress test, plus the same test all the time, so it's easy to compare systems. So for example, I did this same video by using a Ryzen 5 1600. You can find it down in the description. And when I tested CSGO, I had a different average frame rate, which you can check at the end of the footage, so it's easier for you to compare between my videos. I'm using the lowest settings because most people that watch my previous videos asked me to do so. I guess it's just to see the CPU at its maximum potential, I don't know, but I'll talk to you again in the next game. Now I'm testing Fallout 4, and on this one I'll be using TAA as anti-aliasing. I just lowered shadow distance and got raised quality to high, kept amino occlusion on HBAO+, I never enabled weapon debris because that's an NVIDIA specific thing, and the view distance is maxed out. And here the testing will be done in Diamond City, which is one of the places where I had the lower frame rates. And usually at the start of the footage, when I'm just descending in the elevator, the frame rate drops below 60 frames per second, but here that wasn't the case. It stayed over 60 frames per second all the time, which is something that I didn't see for a while. So the last time I saw this was on an i7 4790 a while ago, so I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Everyone needs a haircut. Step up.
Move along.
Win the game. Buy a swatter.
The hub of trade for all Diamond City right here.
Cam I Care cares about you.
Nothing to see here.
Let's do this.
And finally, Batman Arkham Knight. On this one I'll be using normal textures, high shadows, high level of detail, anti-aliasing enabled, and anisotropic filtering on 16 times. You'll see at the bottom right corner of the options menu, according to the game, I'll be using more than 3 gigs of VRAM. Fortunately, the game was wrong. I'm using almost 3 gigs of VRAM, yeah, I'm pretty much at the limit, maybe using a little more than 3, but that didn't stop me from enjoying the game. As you can see, we are over 60 frames per second. Sometimes when I'm destroying a lot of stuff with the Batmobile, I might get a drop or two here and there, very quickly, not really noticeable without the FPS counter. And so far the only stutters that I saw were the usual ones, the ones that I get on all my systems when I'm moving very fast through the map, especially when I eject from the Batmobile and start just flying around. Those happen on all my systems, I always run into them. It just seems to be the game streaming new assets from the hard drive, but the hard drive is not fast enough to do it on time, because the game is just demanding too much from it, I guess. An SSD helps, but it doesn't fix it, which is unfortunate, but it's still a completely playable experience, I have to say. Those stutters happen anyway, but as you will see in the RAM usage, I'm using more than 8 gigs. I went to around 8.5 gigabytes. This is another one of those games I can use more than 8 gigs. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but I played this one with 8 gigabytes before and it was just fine, just more stutters when moving around very fast, so that's something to be aware of. So yeah guys, conclusion time. Do I think it's a good combination? And I would say yes, either with this GTX 1060 or the 6GB version if you can afford it. So if you have the GTX 1060 6GB, expect 8 to 10% more FPS compared to this video. Plus you can use better textures, so for example on Forza Horizon 3 you can use almost the maximum settings. On Batman Arkham Knight you can use better texture quality, same with PUBG and Assassin's Creed Origins as an example. So yeah, if you can get the 6GB version, I'll go for it. Right now games are using more and more VRAM, but it will be a bigger and bigger limitation as time goes on. Then on the processor, the i5-8400 can handle this GPU just fine, even on very CPU intensive games like Assassin's Creed Origins, Battlefield 1 multiplayer with 64 players. It can handle 60 frames per second, so that's good to see, even on a very intensive Hitman map. And there is also another option you might want to consider, a Ryzen 5 1600 or 2600. They are not as good as the i5 on gaming. They should still be very decent for gaming, plus video editing, 3D rendering, all that kind of stuff. So I would say this, if you're only gaming, I will get the i5-8400. You can get a very basic motherboard, plus RAM at 2400 MHz, for example, and the games run just fine without doing much at all, just assembling the PC. But if you do more than gaming, you do gaming plus, I don't know, video editing, 3D rendering, all the extra threads on the Ryzen processor seem to me to be better value. On games you can still get 60 frames per second on most of them, or a little over that, but you also have to spend more on faster RAM, which is one of the things that benefits Ryzen a lot. So yeah, the decision is up to you. I think both platforms offer different things for different users. In my case, since I do a lot of video editing, I use Ryzen. The extra threads really help me out while rendering a video or rendering something on 3ds Max, which is what I use the most other than gaming. But maybe you just play games and want the maximum frame rate possible, and well, in that case the i5 should be a better option. And on the system RAM thing that I was talking about at the start of the video, as you can see, some games can use more than 8 gigs of RAM. For example, Battlefield 1 multiplayer in a 64 player match. Forza Horizon 3 did as well. Then also Just Cause 3 can go over 8 gigs after long periods of time, for example 40 minutes, 1 hour, something like that, can go over the 8 gigs limit. And Batman Arkham Knight, as you could see in this video, used like around 8.5 gigabytes. So if you don't have 16 gigabytes, it's not the end of the world. You can still play games just fine. Those I mentioned just still work pretty well, but you'll notice more stutter in those games, especially on Battlefield 1, because that one really takes advantage of the extra RAM. So if you cannot afford 16 gigabytes at the moment, get at least 8 gigabytes on dual channel, so get 2 4GB sticks. That's very important. And then when you can afford it, just add another 8 gigabytes and you'll be just fine. Anyway guys, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching and see you next time.